All right, we're back with another video. We're doing Dawkins versus Peterson's Memes and Archetypes with Alex O'Connor. Now, I've said this before, I'm not a particular fan of Alex O'Connor. I don't find him particularly interesting. He's certainly illogical. If you need proof of that, you can look at my first commentary video where I went over him talking to Jonathan Peugeot and the many sort of holes and flaws in his thinking as the inability to reason properly. And unfortunately, I think Dawkins is going to suffer from many of the same things. Not really looking forward to watching this, but I'm looking forward to providing context for my audience. So hopefully you'll get something out of this, right? And the purpose of these commentaries is to show you things that you might not have seen just watching the video yourself or talking about it with friends, or things that hopefully other people haven't pointed out already, although I'm sure I'll overlap with quite a few of them. And maybe just give you a little bit of context to see, like, a lot of the problem here is that these issues are far more complex than all three of these gentlemen realize, I would say. And I think a lot of the disagreement is around precisely that, right? So the people who claim a religious tradition, any religious tradition, are sort of curious as to why this is the conversation and to why they don't understand certain core concepts, right, that are built into religious thinking. And that's really what this is about. It's about the ignorance, the paucity of knowledge, the lack of understanding and engagement in many cases in certain concepts that we'll say are not graspable and aren't supposed to be grasped, to be fair, by science. And so I want you to keep that in mind. So if you are in the camp of I already have some exposure to religion, these are going to seem like silly conversations or silly arguments at some point, I suspect. And if you're not in that camp, this is all going to be completely new and fascinating to you. And then hopefully I can sort of bridge that gap, because that's a part of my goal. So let's jump in and see how many parts we're going to have to do this in.
I think our first point of contact, in the spirit of finding those overlapping circles of interest between you two, will be the similarities, if there are any, between the concept of a meme and the concept of an archetype. So, Professor Dawkins, perhaps you can begin by telling us, what is a meme?
A meme is a virus of the mind. So it's something that spreads because it spreads because it spreads. It's something that spreads by imitation. As I understand it, an archetype is quite different from that, because an archetype is something which all humans have as a virtue of being human, something that's built in. So it's not something that spreads as an epidemic. It's something that we all have anyway. And I suppose that it could turn into a meme, but I would think it would be muddying the waters to even say that there's something very much in common between an archetype and a meme.
Okay, right off the jump, all kinds of problems. So Dawkins describes memes as a virus. Okay, where does this virus come from? What medium is it using for spreading? It spreads by memetics, apparently, which is great for René Girard, I suppose. I have talks about René Girard with Justin on this channel, Justin Wells. So you can reference those. And if you want a separate video on that, let me know in the comments. Maybe I'll do one. So Dawkins really isn't talking about that. And then, he's not talking about method of spread or what a virus is or where it comes from, right? And this sounds very much like René Girard. Where does this come? What's the initial condition? Where's the starting point? Right? How do they develop if they develop? It seems that they just spread and they don't come from anywhere. Whereas he seems to also note, he's talking about archetypes. That wasn't the question, sir. But maybe don't answer the question for the person on the other side of the quote debate, because that would break debate format and would be bad, because you're reframing things on purpose. Probably, look, to be fair, he's probably not aware he's doing it, but also this is why formats are important, and debate format in particular is important, right? So that this doesn't happen. He shouldn't be framing archetypes. He should just answer the question he was asked, which is, what is a meme? Now, the interesting thing here is that he's stated a difference without actually pointing out a difference. Archetypes are something inherent to humans. Are memes not inherent to humans, especially if we mimic them? I mean, I don't have an answer. I'm not trying to answer for him. I'm saying, what is the difference between something that's inherent to humans and something that spreads through humans through mimicry? Because I honestly don't know. Like, there could well be many differences. He just kind of states that they exist and moves on. It's a common thing that people do, right? It's a common mistake, I would argue, that people make, is to state a difference without defining a difference. That doesn't sound different to me. It could be. I can't tell. I just don't have enough information. And again, what have I said before in my previous commentaries? When you don't have enough information, you will fill it in. And if you're an optimistic person, you'll fill it in with optimistic information. Okay, I am a pragmatist. I take people's words very seriously. All right, I assume they're being precise and accurate, and usually they are, although they're not aware of that. They say exactly what they mean. Exactly what they mean. And so I suspect that what Dawkins is saying is memes are bad because they're from the outside, and archetypes are good because they're inherent inside, but he doesn't believe in goodness, and therefore archetypes aren't real. That's what he's saying. I don't think he knows he's saying that, but that's pretty much what I got out of it. And your mileage may vary.
Memes are not embedded into the psychology of people as
no, they arise. They're things like the backwards baseball hat, which is not an archetype. I mean, it's something that becomes fashionable and spreads as an epidemic around the population, which is very different from an archetype, which is sort of built in.
Yes, I've heard you in the past, Dr. Peterson, say that a meme is very similar, if not almost identical to an archetype, almost as if you kept pushing the idea of what a meme is, you might end up with an archetype, but perhaps not.
I think maybe the appropriate way of tying the two ideas together, given what Dr. Dawkins just said, is to notice the fact that something spreads because it catches, right? And so things catch because they have an emotional resonance. And so they attract people's interest. And so they attract them in an exploratory manner. That'd be one way of thinking about it. That would be attraction on the positive emotion side, or they attract them on the negative emotion side. And so that would loop the idea of the catchiness of an idea, a meme, let's say, with the more underlying motivational structures. And as the idea is more related to the action of underlying biological motivational structures, it becomes more and more expression of something that's instinctual and archetypal. Like Jung defined an archetype.
Okay, I want to stop it right here. So, what you'll notice is a bunch of flat world stuff. What do I mean by flat world in this case? Well, here's what I mean. First, they're describing a bunch of things and sort of compressing them down. So they're saying, well, things catch. Okay, well, hold on, what's catchiness? Are ideas catchy? How do people catch ideas? How are they mimicked? Mimicry actually explains some of this, right? And one way to talk about this, I don't like any of this framing, by the way. I think it's all garbage. But one way to talk about this is to say, look, memes are things that get mimicked, right? And when they match things that we'll say aren't spontaneously emergent, but represent, we'll say, something in the realm of the Platonic forms, perhaps, or the ethereal realm. Those for me are pretty much the same thing, although we can argue that Plato didn't have as rich an idea of the ethereal realm as we'll say most people do. And therefore, memes are using up your time, energy, and attention, which is your power. See my definition, see my video on power. I'll try to remember to link it here. Sort of, using up your power to go nowhere, right? Whereas when you're mimicking an archetype, You're actually progressing towards something, we'll say, in the ethereal realm greater than yourself, towards a form. All right. This is not that memes aren't in the ethereal realm. It's that they don't make any progress. And I do want to do a video on this model that we came up with about this, the realm of what we called it was the realm of transformative coupling, and how memes don't, they enter that realm and they don't go through it. Whereas, if you're mimicking an archetype, you do go through it. So mimicry is a method, and they're not differentiating the method from the implementation. So if a meme is one implementation and an archetype is another implementation, mimicry is the method, right, that implementation spreads. Whether or not there are other, we'll say, aspects to the implementation that are relevant, they're not bringing any of this up. So some people might call this nuance or detail or whatever, but this is sort of flat world, like, okay, right? So if you want to understand memes as a complete waste of time because they're emergent and random, I think that's a better way to understand memes, by the way, and archetypes as symbolic representations of an ethereal perfection that has been proven over time to be useful over multiple generations. That's fair, right? So memes are short term. Not all memes, right? Some memes are going to accidentally hit on something, sure. Also, almost none of them. So that's important to know. And you can't tell the difference, but that work has been done already. So why are you wasting your time? That would be my line of reasoning there. And see, now we're solved. Like, whole video over. I don't understand why they're getting caught up in something so simple. And the reason why it's simple is because I just have more tools. Right? When you understand implementation and you understand things like replication or mimicry, so you can add two concepts in here and boom, the whole thing expands, right? That's the re-enchantment, if you will, of the world. Yes, the world is already enchanted. You don't need to re-enchant it, but you're re-enchanting it for the person. Right? You're adding a couple of key concepts that help them differentiate things that aren't differentiable without those concepts. Like, if something's not differentiable without the concept, then that's a flat world. So if you divide the world into two political parties and then libertarians start to exist, you can't differentiate the libertarians from either one of the other two groups. It's not possible. Right? When you understand there aren't only two political positions, now all of a sudden you've re-enchanted politics and you can kind of understand where there's maybe a spectrum, right? And maybe a third or fourth group, right? Because there is. Now, the problem with that is that you can always divide forever, and then you have a flood and you have too many groups to track. So you have to be careful when you do that, but also there's some minimum number of things that you need to describe something. So if you want to describe the spread of something that has, well, I'll just put it in the scientific frame as best I can, the movement of something that has a bunch of properties, then you need a movement. You need the properties. You still need implementation, by the way, and you need action apart from the movement. Right? So what happens when you receive a meme is not part of the movement of the meme, right? But there's an action there, right? What happens when you spread a meme, that's another action, right? It's not necessarily part of the movement of the meme because the memes seem to be moving through a different medium than, we'll say, material reality. Now, none of these three gentlemen, as near as I can tell, has any concepts that would account for all of the parts that I just talked about that are required to understand, I would argue, anything. Anything. Do memes spread through speech? Some of them do. Oops. Do they spread through pictures? Some of them do. Well, what kind of pictures? Well, it could be a photograph, because I've seen memes spread through photographs. Oh no, they could spread through TV. They could spread through the internet. They could spread through YouTube or Rumble or TikTok. Oh no. Right. But these things matter. That's sort of the medium is the message, which is wrong, by the way, but there's a point there, which is why I mentioned it, right? Oh, so there's an implementation in the spreading of the meme, and that matters because you can't spread the same type of meme through words as you can through visual medium. Oh, that's the medium is the message, right? Or the medium limits the message, right? Or the medium changes the message by constraining it. Yes. So more or fewer constraints changes the message. Right. Right. Or at least it changes the nature of message you're trying to deliver. I would argue you don't have to change the message with the medium. Some messages can't be delivered through some mediums. See how many pieces there are at play here? This is a very complex thing. It's not complicated. It's complex. It's not linear and discrete. That would be complicated. It's poetically connected, right? It's a continuous, connected, multivariate sort of a thing. It's very hard for our brains to grasp. It's intuitive, right? You don't know memes because you break them down. You know memes because you intuit what they're referring to and how that's all connected all at once. And that's a huge difference. And they're not the difference between a meme. Again, memes are emergent, and archetypes are things that are there all the time and have been there before. Memes are manifested, I don't like the word created, manifested on the fly by any random person. I've made memes. It's not that hard, right? But what is the usefulness of those memes? Well, actually, the first meme I ever made was the meta meme. I made it more than 15 years ago now, I think. Maybe 12 years ago, but more than 10 anyway. It was a long time ago. My meta meme is, I do not think that meme memes what you think it memes. Right. And so I'm playing on all the elements of a meme and saying memes are worthless. And I was saying that many years ago because it was very obvious, the pattern at the time, at least to me. If it's not obvious to you, fair enough. But also, maybe this is a bad game for you to play. If you didn't see that memes are just going to spread and flood the world and not going to convey the same message to people because it's very hard to do that. There are ways to do it. I think we call them the wisdom texts, things like the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita. You know, the texts like that seem to contain, I believe what Peterson's going to talk about next, archetypal patterns. That's one way to think about them. Navigating patterns, archetypal patterns. No, can't be. So those conveyances are not memes, right? Because they're not created by random people on the internet, for example, who just woke up in the morning and came up with them and are using typically pop culture references. It's not that those memes aren't referencing something outside of themselves that isn't just pop culture, but the things they're referencing are patterns. How do you express a pattern? Well, you might take one static image, say, of the American version of The Office, which is a horrible show that I've not really watched much because it's horrible, and a certain scene, which maybe I haven't seen, almost certainly, right? And you're pairing it with certain words that maybe weren't even in the show, right? In a context. There's three components there. And how those components connect, that's how the meme has relevance realization. John Vervaeke, right? That's how that works. It's not all that hard, right? The problem is most memes serve as entertainment because they are temporary and highly context dependent. One way you can understand this is with comedy. If you listen to some of the comedians over the decades, so you can pick a comedian out of a given decade and then pick the people that were less popular and listen to their jokes, and then listen to the jokes of somebody like Bill Cosby is a great example. Listen to Bill Cosby's old routines from I think the 60s and 70s. There's audio of it out there of his old routines. The things he's talking about are timeless. They're issues around children and families. Well, it just so happens, hopefully all my dear viewers understand this, that children and families have been around since the beginning. oddly. And so when you talk about them, people can relate to that. And the things you talk about with them are likely going to represent patterns that people are familiar with because they probably enacted them or saw them enacted. Right? When you make a joke about the current president, once nobody knows that president anymore, that joke isn't understandable anymore. So that's the difference right there. Are you talking about, we'll call them perennial patterns, right? Or are you talking about something that happened yesterday and will be forgotten tomorrow? And I know that's a little hyperbolic. Also, that happens, by the way. So there's a fundamentally important difference there. Another way they flatten the world is time, right? But the statement I just made is a statement of time. A meme that lasts over time is an archetype. All memes that last over time would be definitionally representing an archetype or would be archetypes themselves. But memes are typically only representations and not the thing in and of itself. I don't want to invoke map. It's not a map. The world has multiple layers to it. Right? And so you can have something that, just because I guess I have to, can 30% represent something and something that 60% represents something. And those exist at different parts of reality, different layers of hierarchical reality. Because reality is hierarchical. That's why hierarchy is older than trees. Hopefully I laid that out well to show you the flat world where memes and archetypes can just be joined because, with no time passing and no thought about how things go away or decay, is a good way to say it, and are subject to entropy. And bang, sure, the idea of meme and the idea of archetype with nothing else outside and no starting point, by the way, because we've compressed time, are pretty much the same, especially if we ignore all the properties and all the other things you need to describe them in terms of their motion through the world, their existence, etc. But that's a very flat description.
Essentially, is something like the manifestation of an instinct in image and then also in behavior. So the deepest level is something like the instinct, and that would be motivation or emotional drive. And then there's a manifestation of that in imagination and behavior, and it's more culturally constructed there. And you could also imagine that there are depths of these ideas. The baseball hat idea, for example, that would be something that's manifesting itself at a fairly shallow level. But there's a reason that the backwards baseball hat caught on. It speaks of the moment for whatever reason. And it's linked to the biology through the fact that it captures interest for some reason.
Okay. Wow. So, man, Dr. Peterson's really letting me down lately. This is all individualistic from the individual out. Like everything he said is linked to biology. Okay, but where did that biology come from? Because these are the important questions. The rest of this stuff is garbage questions. Like, no. The backwards baseball cap is a symbol of something. Sure. What is it symbolic of? A pattern. That pattern pre-existed you and pre-existed biology itself. How do you know that, Mark? You can't make such a bold, oh, yes, I can. Because whatever evolution is following a pattern. Maybe we don't know what that pattern is yet because it hasn't unfolded over time. Weird how secular speak can just like flow right into concepts that we'll say religious folk are quite familiar with and sort of start from. That might be a hint. And so these patterns manifest in different ways at different times, right? One way to look at backwards baseball caps is to say, okay, we had a rising order, particularly in the United States, around the institution of baseball, which was absolutely everywhere in the early 1900s. That was the entertainment of the day. It's movies now. It was not movies back then. What people did on their days off and when they had extra time was go to see a ball game. There were also many more ball players. right? Fewer professional ball players, perhaps, especially at a ratio of people playing baseball, and therefore it was harder to find the good players and gather them up, by the way, right? Interesting. And then that became a symbol of order. A bunch of people having a certain socioeconomic lifestyle for the most part, right? Living out sort of the 1950s, Leave It to Beaver sort of thing. Yeah, I know baseball predates the 1950s. What I'm talking about predates the 1950s. I get that. Also, same representation, by the way, right? The representation of, what do I want to call it? The representation of a stable, normalized family order. That's what baseball caps represented. So who puts on backwards facing baseball caps? Rebels. That's who. Always rebels. Why? I'm not going to use this in the way it was intended. I'm not going to use this in the way it's most useful. I'm not going to use this in that way because I don't want to represent that I grew up within a stable family order that was normalized. And if you look at people who wear backwards baseball caps, almost all of them did not grow up that way. And the few exceptions are the, quote, black sheeps of the family. Well, that's weird. What an odd coincidence, you might say. See, simple observation resolves this in minutes. It doesn't take that long. Now, these guys aren't looking at that, right? Why? Why aren't they looking? Because they can't. They're looking at it from the personal, individual perspective. Individuals don't exist, by the way, outward. You can't understand a phenomena that spreads across multiple persons by looking at it from your personal individual perspective or substituting that perspective for someone else's personal individual perspective. Why? Because you're at the same layer of analysis. You're at the same level. You're looking across a plane, a horizontal plane. You can't understand things like that by deriving them from the emergence, from the personal individual perspective. That's why they always mention the dreaded culture word that's like out here and all. Okay. You don't have a motivation to wear anything at all, technically, without culture. You also don't have a motivation to really leave your house or your cave or whatever without culture. So separating these two things is ridiculous. It's absurd and it's inappropriate because you cannot understand those things if you separate them in that way, because individuals don't exist. You were born into a culture. You may not like that, but you can be sad because you're not going to not have been born into a culture. Okay? Your ability to understand your culture is going to be limited. In what ways? I do not know. I do not know you. I do not know how you can see, what things you can see in the world, how well you see them, how much time, energy, and attention you're putting to looking. I don't know any of those things. But all of those are factors and more into what you can see about the culture. Some people can see quite a bit about the culture that they're in, and especially if they've experienced other cultures, because you need contrast to see, can have a lot of insight. I get that. Insight can be helpful. It can also destroy the world, so it's not a plus. Like, more information is not always better. I need to do that video. I realize this. I'll get on it. I promise. So the problem then becomes, why are you separating those two things? Why are you flattening the world? Why are you looking at everything from your or from an individual, quote, perspective outward, when this is all resolvable if you just add a few more concepts? Well, maybe you're trying for an answer, quote, easy answer, and there isn't one. That could be true.
So perhaps something like the archetype being a more fundamental psychological concept that memes can then play upon. The backwards cap catches on.
Well, that seems implausible to me, but the idea that the archetype could be a reason why some memes spread, that seems to me to be plausible if you believe in archetypes at all. Yes.
But you prefer to think of memes, or you do think of memes as, you refer to them as a virus.
Yes,
It
it's,
doesn't have to have a negative
it's the
connotation.
spreadability which is the salient point. And if chiming in with an archetype is a reason why they might spread, then I could go with that.
Yeah, and
Okay, so you see more flattening here. Chiming in with an archetype is the reason they spread. What? These are two different things. The reason they spread is called mimicry. It is a behavior that humans exhibit. It is independent of your definition of meme, archetype, or any number of other things like ideology or religion even. All of these things are wrapped up in mimicry, which is a separate concept. You shouldn't be tying together those two concepts at all. There's no reason to, unless you're trying to understand something that maybe you can't, because you just can't track enough stuff. For example, that happens to lots of people, right? There's some point at which you can't remember all the things you need to remember, right? There's some point at which the concepts are too much for you in your head. See this a lot in programming, for example. Boy, do you see a lot in software engineering. My goodness. You will, and everybody has a limit, and everybody's limit is vastly different. And maybe Dawkins is like past his limit already, and that's why he wants to wrap these two things together. The reason why things spread is just mimicry. That's what it's called. There's a word for it already. You could just use that word. How does mimicry work? Well, mimicry works as a subset of attention and relevance realization. And now we're into John Vervaeke's work. This is why I like John Vervaeke's work. He actually has a science for this, which Dawkins is unaware of. Also, why is virus the thing you're using for spread? Biology has a bunch of material things spreading in a bunch of different ways. Why are you using virus in biology? Bacterium spread, and they don't spread the way a virus spreads at all. Well, that's good to know. They might have similar spreading mechanisms. By the way, viruses don't have a single spreading mechanism. So saying it spreads like a virus really isn't saying much, because I don't know what you mean. Like, okay, like an airborne virus, because not all viri spread through the air. Like, how do they spread? And why, again, why is it that virus is very negative? This is odd behavior. I want you to notice all this stuff. This is strange. This is just a strange way to talk about anything. Why are you picking these words?
And presumably archetypes don't act in the same way. They don't spread through cultures. They don't sort of grow up and die in individual generations. They're much more foundational than that.
I think you have to think about it hierarchically. You know, that there's something in the structure that would make itself manifest as an archetype. There's something that's foundational and deep that wouldn't change any faster in a sense than the species itself changes. But then there would be efflorescences of that idea that would be less permanent as they were more attuned to the specifics of the time. So, and that's not saying anything different really than saying that there are ideas that make themselves manifest at different levels of depth, which is also a complex thing. Like, it's not that easy to specify what makes an idea deep, which makes it more archetypal, and what makes it transient and trivial. There's a relationship between such ideas. There's no idea so trivial that it doesn't touch the depths, because no one would care about it, right? So, but archetypal ideas do have that capacity to spread virally and to rise and fall. You see that, I think you see that in the history of religious ideas. You know, that religious ideas can be very catching, because otherwise they wouldn't spread. Now, there's variation in them like there is in languages, but there's also something that's core that makes them identifiable, let's say, as religious ideas rather than as any other sort of idea. I mean, one of the things I was really interested about.
Okay, I got to pause it there, because Peterson went through a lot here. So let's kind of break this down. So we've added hierarchy. Yay. I'm very happy with that move. It's a good move. Thank you. But we don't understand implementation at all, right? And implementation and scaling are two concepts that are completely missing, that explain a bunch of stuff. So let me give you an example. the way that somebody understands an image, we'll say an archetypal image, is going to be different based on their experience. It's also going to be different based on what other images they have been exposed to. It's also going to be different based on their education. For example, Anthony Burgess wrote a book called The Clockwork Orange. I have not finished reading it. But in his book, he's making a reference to another author's work. That reference is not overt. It's not part of the words in the book. It's built into the structure of the chapters. Now, I had no way to know this. So had I not read the wonderful commentary at the beginning of the book, I wouldn't have understood that 21 chapters is really important to the book, because there's allegedly 7 stages of man, and there's a reference to the 7 stages of man in the structure of the book. And so you can look at that as different layers of analysis, I think is the way Peterson talks about it. I used to talk about it as levels, but when I was younger, but layers of analysis works much better anyway. So I stand corrected by the great Dr. Peterson. I'm happy with that. When you have a level of sophistication where you understand there's 7 stages of man, and I don't even remember where that comes from, but it comes from somewhere, allegedly. I don't have that reference. I didn't read that material, right? And then you notice, because you have to notice that there's 21 chapters, and then you notice the development in the book, which again, I haven't finished it, but apparently the development in the book is character starts out one way and ends a different way. That's character development, right? The character in the beginning and the character in the end are not the same because of the trials in the middle. This is where, Campbell sees this hero's journey. That's all bunk, throw it all out. Everybody goes on journeys and are transformed by their experience. Now, how is different for everybody, even with the same experience. Nobody likes that answer. Also observably true. It can be, but it isn't necessarily. That makes it worse. Also true. When I go to a concert, I get something different out of it when you go to the same concert, even if we're at the same concert next to each other. Sorry, just how it happens. I brought this example up before. There's tons of other examples, right? Again, some people are going to read A Clockwork Orange and understand the reference to the 7 stages of man that I don't have, right? And there's probably a deeper meaning in the fact that there's 21 chapters, right, and not just 7, we'll say. And it also affects the movie because apparently they dropped the 21st chapter and changed the whole meaning of what the author was trying to get across. So all of that nuance is missed. In the same way, you could have an image of a mother and a child, and that might be universal in some way, but the way a Catholic might understand that and the way a Hindu might understand that is different. But there's still an archetypal reference there. And so you can see without implementation, you can't recognize the archetypes. And without scale, you don't understand what that means, because scale is the thing that adds, we'll say, different levels of understanding, right? How does the culture understand the figure? Oh, the culture prefers a certain implementation of mother and child over this other culture, which has a different implementation, right? A different image to represent that, or images, or statues, or what, right? There's different implementations. Oh, without those two concepts of scale and implementation, describing this becomes difficult. And so you can see them struggling to describe something that's actually very simple to describe. It doesn't give you a nice, comfortable, easy to grasp and understand answer. That's the trade-off. By the way, I have a video on trade-offs. That's the trade-off. If you really want to understand what's going on in a way that you can control it, you're screwed because you can't. If you just want to understand the phenomena and then be able to study it, that's not a problem. But you need these other concepts. You need to understand mimicry. You need to understand entropy. You need to understand implementation, and you need to understand the scale, because the scale matters. Backwards baseball caps don't become a thing if they don't also happen to end up representing a stable, happy, ordered family, right? With money, right? With at least some money, because baseball caps are expensive, right? And again, how do I know this? There are other hats like that that get worn properly and never get subverted. Well, that's weird. Why? What's the difference? Oh, the difference is in the scale and what's happening at scale, right? Societies are expanding their scale. So in the past, the number of differences between different societies may have been greater or lesser, by the way, but the mixing was different. There was less mixing between castes or classes. Particularly the United States is the ultimate, quote, melting pot. What are we melting together? Castes, systems, class systems. Those are different, by the way. That's what we're melting together. Not people of different races. Also that, but what we're actually melting are the caste systems. And now they're emerging new ones, because those are not optional patterns of the universe. Peterson can't engage with any of this for whatever reason, at least not in this context. And that's the scary part. In other contexts, what I said might be perfectly understandable and, okay, but maybe he can't apply it to archetypes. Certainly seems that way so far. But these little details matter, right? This framing matters.
I sent you an email at one time asking you if you had read Mircea Eliade, especially The Sacred and the Profane, but he also has a 3-book series called A History of Religious Ideas. And I really like A History of Religious Ideas. It's a great book. And one of the things it does is analyze a particular widespread religious motif, which is the battle between the gods in heaven. You see this idea in many, many cultures. And each god is the expression of a mode of perception or a mode of being. And what you see happening in a multitude of cultures is that there are many, many ways of seeing the world and acting in it that are metamorphized into something divine. And as cultures mingle and mix, their gods compete in the space of the imagination, and something like a hierarchy forms. That's the emergence of something like monotheism. And the associate...
So we've been talking a little bit about the concept of a meme. I think it would be strange to be suspicious of the idea that memes are a thing that do exist and transmit, but there might be more room for suspicion about this concept of the archetype. I was wondering, Professor Dawkins, what you think about the concept of archetypes in general.
Well,
this is fascinating. I don't know why O'Connor interrupted. I think that basically he destroyed Peterson's flow here. Peterson was sort of in the process of making an important point, I think. Although I don't know, because he's been interrupted. I don't know where he was going to go with that. So I don't know why we were redirected here, but I just wanted to note that.
For example, if we take the idea of the gods competing with each other, that I take it is a proper archetype, because it's present in all cultures. I presume you mean is something that's built in genetically, ultimately, I suppose, that something about our brains makes different cultures invent the same kinds of religious symbols.
Yes.
Okay. Oh my goodness. Why would anybody think about the world this way? So this is creation denial. This is just not dealing with your brain did not come first. Okay? The brain was... Our brains do not create the things around us. They represent the things around us within our imagination, maybe. Different conversation, by the way. The way Dawkins talks is as if all of these things come from an individual brain, right? So now he can't understand culture because that's what happens when, we'll say, quote, individual brains have to interact with something else, by the way, not just each other. You'll notice that too. Like, listen for that. People will talk about, well, when you have to interact with one another, what about nature, bro? You have to interact with nature too. It's not like we have one thing and we've added another thing, which is, another person or more persons or something. No. Both of those are embedded in nature. Another way to say nature is creation. Oh. Right. So the argument is that archetypes are outside of our brains, and our brains are mapping to them. That's the flat world, right? They don't have that concept. How can our brains be mapping? No. It arises from our brain out into the world. No, it definitely does not do that. That is for sure. Right? You're fitted to the environment you're in, and therefore a bunch of things come from the environment, and telling the two apart is hard. Absolutely. That's a much better discussion to have. Let's have that discussion. Right? Unfortunately, that's a what is reality discussion. That's been had a billion times by philosophers, and they can't make any progress on it because they can't think properly about the world, because they don't think in terms of starting points, which is what you need to do. Right? In order to use logic, reason, rationale, you need to have a starting point. I suggest being is good and creation, whatever those are. And if you proceed from there, you can get a pretty long way. You might also want to add a creator in there just to round it out to a nice round number like 3. Oh, wait. Anyway, 3 is a good number. 2 is always going to lead you into trouble. Binary thinking bad.
Things like a battle between gods is one.
That's one.
And there might be others. It's not that convincing. I mean, it's such an obvious thing because we have human battles, and therefore an idea of battles between gods would not be that implausible. So it doesn't strike me as a very penetrating observation.
Well,
penetrating? I honestly, I don't even understand how Dawkins is talking. I'm like, what are you talking about? It doesn't strike you that way. It strikes everybody else who's ever lived that way. So the fact it doesn't strike you a certain way is irrelevant to the argument, because we're not arguing about you and your personal feelings. Oh, is that what happened, Mark? Yes, that's what happened. You just witnessed a narcissist making it all about himself. That's exactly what he just did. It doesn't strike me as a particularly penetrating idea. Okay, that's because you have a thick head and nothing can penetrate it, though. Oops, but you didn't even consider that possibility because you lack humility. Oh, wow, look at that. I just legit psychologically dissected his narcissism. Yes, I did. And it's correct. And you're not going to find another explanation that works as well. Why would you even say that? You're in a discussion with other people. You're here. The fact that you do or do not find something particularly penetrating in the conversation you've already agreed to, where you didn't deal with the point. If you want to attack the point, okay, so what would the point be? The point would be something like, well, the fact that we recreate this over and over again just says it's a universal. Universals exist. Who cares? That's valid and not narcissistic. Notice, who cares? It's universal, not making it about me in that argument. I'm saying, what difference does it make? Now, I would never make that argument because I find the topic of archetypes fascinating and I'd love to dig in more, right? But without this enchanted world, right? Without this idea that there's something outside and above, has to be both, by the way, can't be just one, outside and above us, that we're mapping our to with our brains, which is what's actually happening, by the way. We know this. Like, I don't understand. Peterson should know this. This is in the literature. It's actually in the experiments. It's in the data. This is what maps of meaning is about to some extent, as far as I can tell. That's a more interesting conversation to have. But you notice we're stuck with this individual outward-looking perspective. For some stupid reason, I don't understand why we're stuck here. I really don't. I don't understand this at all.
Well, I think the thing that's interesting about it, the thing that's been interesting to me about it is to start to understand the nature of the universal themes and how they're expressed in stories. I mean, one of the things I wanted to explore with you, because I think this is an idea that's at the core of the cultural conflict, is the postmodern types seem to have stumbled onto something which I actually think is true. And they're not the only discipline that's come to this realization, because you can see it emerging in neuroscience and in AI and in robotics as well, that we see the world of facts through something that when described as a story, because we have to prioritize our perceptions. We have to prioritize facts. And as far as I can tell, a story is a verbal account of how our perceptions and the facts that we encounter are prioritized. So for example, when you go see a movie,
Wow. Okay. I don't think I've heard this formulation before out of Peterson. Let me see if I can help you all out with this. A story is a description of an implementation, we'll say actual or imagined, because it doesn't matter. Oops. Of a sequence, right? Which determines that sequence and the, what do I want to say, elements of that sequence in relation to a hierarchy, set of principles, or one, I should say, one or more principles, and the world. That's what a story is. Notice how many components I have to add in, right? And then someday explain. All right. So it matters a lot, right? If somebody fired a gun first, right? Generally, if somebody fires a gun at you and you're not, let's say, neither of these people are police officers, right? And you fire back, the person that fires back has less liability legally than the person that fired first. Sequence matters. Right? Now, there are times when the person that fired first is justified, irrespective of the other person, and it's the other person who has all the liability. These are details of a story that I have not given you enough detail to understand yet. What did Mark just say? The knowledge that you require to have a valid story that you can make sense of was not given to you, and therefore you do not actually understand the story that I'm trying to tell. The principle that I'm outlining, that in some cases the sequence matters and in some cases it doesn't, and the reason was not given. If I'm walking down the street and somebody starts screaming at me and pulls out a gun, and I happen to have a gun, and they fire first, I'm all set. I shoot them dead. They're dead. There's no liability for me. Also, somebody comes down the street, they're mentally ill, they pull out a gun, I see the gun, and before they can fire, I draw my gun and shoot. I am also not liable, by the way, or at least as liable. Sorry, bro. There's no principle you can apply to the sequence because there wasn't enough information. Principles depend on the information. The sequence matters, but it matters in relation to other things. So you can't say, oh, the sequence matters in relation to what the sequence itself says. This person fired first. This person fired first is insufficient information to draw a conclusion. This person fired first, this person fired second, this person fired third. Who cares? Because you don't have enough information to draw any conclusions about anything. And because we like to fill in details, we'll fill in the details. And we'll go, oh, I know who's guilty. No, you don't. You can't. It's not possible. Information doesn't exist. You might be able to figure that out with enough information if that information is accurate. Oops, right. And that's where everybody trips. Everyone gets tripped up on that. Sure, if you had access to perfect information, which you never do, by the way, ever, and you interpret that information correctly, it is possible that you could derive who is to blame. That is theoretically possible. Theoretically possible, by the way. But you have to meet a bunch of other conditions. And so when you talk about story, you can't flatten it down to, oh, we tell a story and that gives us a bunch of information about hierarchy. No, it doesn't. How do you tell a good story from a bad story? Oh, a good story matches something within the world that is useful to us because it relates us, or maybe not personally us, but maybe somebody we know, to the things that are already, we'll say, pre-existing in the world. So just talking about story is already a problem because there are bad stories. And that's why people go down this road of the postmoderns had a point. No, they did not. That's false. It's provably wrong. They said something obvious and clear and true. Who cares? That happens all the time by accident. All the time. Right? 3-year-olds stumble across, words of wisdom from thousands of years ago. I've experienced this multiple times in my life with many different children. This isn't an interesting fact of the world. It happens all the time. So the fact that the postmoderns said something obvious like context matters, which is literally all their stuff boils down to, actually, for real. No kidding. And they make additional points about, most of which are lies, by the way, about, well, somebody gave you that context. Well, yeah, somebody. Usually the person you say gave me the context is not the person that gave me the context, by the way. And usually the mechanism of transport for the context, right, how the context got to me, is not what you say it is. Because you're liars. Because you're bad people to a man. Don't be bad. This isn't that hard. Like, they didn't have a point. They said something banal and obvious and then used it to manipulate the world. And everybody can do that trick. Yes, they can. I don't understand. If you've got children, you know this. I don't have children and I know this. Maybe I've been around children and I've noticed it. Relevance realization. Children will just change the conditions of the story to make themselves not guilty. I mean, adults do this too, but like children do it remarkably well and all the time. And it's usually very funny. Bill Cosby uses that fact in his comedy routine. Is he a postmodern? All comedy uses framing. All of it. It's not the only way to make comedy, but Bill Cosby's early work in particular, all he does is reframe things. Right? You take the perspective of an adult and cast it onto a child or into a child's behavior, and comedy emerges pretty reliably. It's amazing. Do the experiment for yourself. It's not that hard, right? This is the point of the postmoderns. Thanks, guys. Thanks, geniuses. What next? The sun rises in the east? I don't, like, where are we going? Of course. Where does this context come from? Oh, that's where we're stuck. See, because the postmoderns tell you that context, very much like Girard, by the way, context comes from other people. Really? I mean, it gets communicated through other people. Oh, those are very different statements, my friend. Very different statements. It doesn't emerge from other people. I'm not saying that it can't, but in general, it does not. Right? It comes from outside of them. Like, because again, where did they get it from? Oh, this is the problem. We don't have a starting point to know where they got the context from that they gave to you. Oh, no, that's just culture. We'll just blame culture. But culture is a map that is shared between a group of people that are generally around one another, roughly speaking. I'm being very compressive here. I get that. I'm going to flatten this quite a lot, in fact. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the different people in the culture don't have to understand, or even have, maybe they do understand, but have different understandings of the same thing and still be part of the culture. That's not a problem for culture. Why? Because culture is scaled up to a group. It's not scaled down or flattened to an individual. Oh. So now, if we do something wrong or something bad happens, we can blame culture, like Rousseau did. But Rousseau was just wrong. Like, this isn't that hard. Rousseau was wrong, and he was a jerk. Like, he was just a jerk. Like, why were we listening to jerks who are wrong? I don't get it. But it's all the same exact point, and it all leads to the same exact evil. I'm still a no on evil. Don't do that. This isn't that. Just avoid all the bad stuff. This isn't that hard. Like, really. You can say, oh, it's not bad stuff because it was made bad because our culture told us it was bad. Well, where did our culture get the badness from? Oh, it doesn't work. Oh, well, maybe it's bad irrespective of the culture. Yes. How do you know that? Because not all cultures survive. This isn't that hard. It's not that hard. Why are we making this hard? This is really easy. And I'm using the secular, evolutionary, biological garbage frame that I despise more than anything. It doesn't even work in your scientific frame, bro. This isn't even difficult. That's the flattening of the world. This is what you get when you start from yourself out, that middle out thinking. I'll link that video here. I actually like that video, and it doesn't get nearly enough credit, I think. So middle out thinking, that's what these guys are doing. As much as I love Peterson, he's a total middle out thinker, unfortunately, right? They'll give lip service to emergence and emanation, but at the end of the day, they start from themselves and work out. I get it. That's the perspective you're stuck with to some extent, but also you could understand something higher outside of you. It's possible. People do it. You could embrace that instead of resisting it or rebelling against it.
The movie has a hero, and what the writers do is they show you how the hero prioritizes his perceptions, what he attends to, and how he acts, and you derive from that the story of his life and his ethic. And
I just want to point something out. I don't know where these people were educated. Look, I'm sorry I have to do this, but really, when I went to school, not all stories had heroes. They just didn't. I don't even know where this concept comes from, because when I grew up, no one ever said anything like that at all, ever. Ever. We use the term protagonist and antagonist. We use those terms for sure. My English teacher taught me something that, quite honestly, I'm still trying to disprove, because I'm like that. He said, there's only 3 types of stories. And I was like, 3 types of stories. I'll prove you wrong. Still trying. Failing miserably. Don't tell anybody. He said there's you with nature, right? So man against nature, man against man, and man against himself. That's it. 3 types of stories. All stories fall in one of those 3 buckets. And it's like, wow. And as long as you accept that aliens are part of nature, which is not really a leap, by the way. You may think it is, but that's because you've been brainwashed by stupid people. It works fine. And as long as you understand there are protagonists, you don't need anti-heroes. Oops, maybe using the word protagonist works better than using the word hero, because not all stories have heroes. Was that hard? That doesn't seem hard to me. Now you can understand all stories better, instantly. They're not all about heroes. They're not all heroes' journeys or whatever nonsense Campbell spouts this week, because him and his people that came after him just make up new stuff by the day, as near as I can tell, to fool you into believing that they're smart, when in fact they're trying to redo literature, which didn't need the help and can't be enhanced by them anyway, because they're morons. It's good to know. Don't believe me? Look at StoryGrid. Go read Go read some of the hero archetype descriptions on StoryGrid and tell me if you watched the movie with that title and it matches the description, because I've done this experiment with a bunch of people and they were like, what movie are you talking about? It says Harry Potter, but it says The Matrix, but it's not describing those movies at all, right? Oops. And so I don't know where this idea comes from. And again, we're not going to account for, because, I mean, maybe we will later, but we're not going to account for, what about a bad story, dude? What about a story that doesn't resonate? This explanation cannot, and look, maybe he'll add to the explanation later or whatever, but like, this explanation cannot account for good versus bad, because it's a flat world. And we haven't brought that up. What is higher and what is lower? But we can scream hierarchy all day long, but what Peterson's actually describing is vertical order. Okay, vertical order is important. I agree. There's a horizontal order. Sure, there's a vertical order. Abso-freaking-lutely there is. But it's not describing hierarchy. Right? It's not a full description of hierarchy. It's a partial description of hierarchy. There's an order to hierarchy. Sure, absolutely. And that order is fungible. Yes, sometimes you get to talk to the king, even though you're a lowly peasant. That was always true. Sure. It just wasn't true for all peasants. This is where people get messed up, right? They take the individual case, the specific case, and confuse it for the general case. And maybe there's a reason for that. Oh, maybe the reason is you suck and you shouldn't talk to the king because you're a retard. Yeah, maybe. Probably, almost certainly, by the way. Oh, right. So once you unflatten the world, once you re-enchant the world, you realize, oh, this all makes perfect sense. And it might just be that we don't want to be the person that can't talk to the king, even though we're a peasant. Yeah, maybe. Maybe that explains all of this, actually. Maybe.
The idea that we have a story, that we have to organize our perceptions in priority, and that the description of that organization is a story, that's a very revolutionary idea. And I think the postmodernists got that right. And I think that's why we have a culture war going on, at least in part, is because the idea that we see the world through a story, or that a story is a description of the structure through which we see the world, I think that's accurate, because we have to prioritize our perceptions.
So, Professor Dawkins,
I don't know why this explains the culture war. If that was always true, and it is and has always been true, why would that create the culture war? Well, maybe pointing it out enables the culture war, because it does. Just gonna skip to the end. It definitely enables the culture war. I know, don't do that. And then you don't have a culture war. Weird. True, though. Huh. Unforced error? Self-inflicted wounds, anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Right. That's not the only thing. Like, just pointing it out won't change anything. It's not like all of the ideas that the so-called postmoderns had they're not interesting ideas. They're ideas that 3-year-olds regularly generate by themselves without help. For real. So, like, I don't, like, again, they do this trick, right? They change the story. They change the context. They do both, right? And then they're not guilty. And they didn't take the cookie. But you were the only one in the room, but there are ghosts. Fair. You still took the cookie, though. So, this doesn't resolve anything. It seems like an explanation for the culture war, right? Oh, all along this was true is not an explanation for anything that's new, ever. I hate to tip my hand, but also, I don't know why I'd have to say that. Apparently I do. Like, sure, the quote, discovery or whatever of the postmoderns was always true, and we didn't have a culture war. So that can't be it. Like, we can rule that out. Pointing it out maybe plays a factor. I agree, it does. Equality doctrine, giving everybody access to telling their own story, say online, maybe using pictures. We might call them memes. Maybe that is bad because everyone's trying to play the culture game through manipulation of framing. I can get on board with that because that happened for sure. None of this is a plus, though. Maybe Dawkins coining the term meme contributed to the culture war, in fact. That's quite possible. I don't know. I don't particularly care. But that's interesting. But you notice he seems to be giving you an explanation for culture war when in fact that didn't even happen. And the thing that he said is necessarily not entirely correct because it was always true.
That's a tricky problem.
Well, I would prioritize my perceptions like this. The fact that I care about are the facts that are true and have evidence going for them. And I'm not that interested in symbols. I think, Dr. Peterson, you're drunk on symbols.
Yes, you mentioned. I've heard that comment. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, for example, I counted up in your book, We Who Wrestle with God, the number of references to Cain. There are 356 references to Cain in the book, and 20 references to the descendants of Cain. You're obsessed with Cain because Cain is symbolic of evil. All the evil in the world, you more or less blame Cain for. And this is Cain. I mean, you don't believe Cain actually existed, I presume.
Holy macaroni. Like, what even was that? Here's Dawkins psychologizing Dr. Peterson. Some of his observations are valid. Peterson focuses on Cain too much. I don't think Peterson talks about Cain as the source of all evil. Also, he's not in the Bible. So there's that. But I want to make a point about this symbols. Like, Dawkins doesn't care about symbols. Okay, bro. You don't have to, but symbols are what allow you to order things vertically. So you want to talk about vertical causality? Guess how you resolve order in the world of vertical causality? Symbols. Guess how else you resolve them? No other way. Sorry, bro. So yeah, you don't care about symbols because you're living in a flat world. You can't even see up and down. And now you're accusing Dr. Peterson of reducing evil to Cain and making Cain symbolic. Cain is symbolic of something, many things, because symbols aren't symbolic of one thing ever, by definition. Ever. That's good to know. So I find that whole move fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Well, I think of Cain as, well,
Do you believe Cain existed?
I think the pattern that Cain represents is an eternal pattern. And so
yes,
it's a
that's
higher
different.
level of existence.
That's different. I realize
well,
that.
there are Cain types who exist, and there could well be.
There are Cain types. But Cain himself, I mean, you give the game away where you say in your book, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in the natural way. Now that betrays you as it were pretending you think they really existed, because you wouldn't have said they were born in a natural way unless you were muddling up facts with symbols there, because you don't think that Cain and Abel existed.
Well, I don't.
Wow. Talk about giving away the game. Yes, Dawkins, you gave away the game, bro. Flat world confirmed, right? If you're talking about I hate this word. We'll call it fictional character. And you could say this fictional character was born of parents on a planet called Krypton in a galaxy far, far away, wherever Krypton is. I'm not a comic book guy. Or you can say that the character was born in a natural way. I don't see a problem here, Dawkins. Like, I don't see a problem. Right? He's not giving anything away at all. I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I have no idea what you're saying. A representation of, yeah. So if you want to understand this somewhat symbolically, I'm not gonna claim any symbolism knowledge here, because I probably don't have a sufficient way to talk about this. If a character in a book is born in a natural way, they are not a deity, for example. They're not an alien, they're not a deity, they're not an exception to the rule, right? In other words, they're representative of you and I. That's how symbolism works to some extent, right? I'm compressing a lot of stuff. I get that. A little leeway, I have a limited amount of time, and homicidal tendencies upon hearing this. This is absurd, right? He didn't give anything away. You can talk about fictional characters in that way to relate them back to the audience. Who gave it away was Dawkins. I don't care about symbols. Yeah, now you don't understand a bunch of concepts like the concept I just outlined. That yes, you can talk about fictional characters that we'll say do not exist and never have existed, and maybe never could exist. Fine. Right? In that way, so that they can be related to you and I. You can do that. That doesn't give anything away. That's called storytelling 101, bro. Like, where are you even getting that from? This is foolish. And you look at smug look on his face the whole time. It's just disgusting. Just disgusting. Not a fan. Not a fan.
What do I think about Cain and Abel? I said, I think the pattern that they represent always exists. Always exists.
You understand that that's a different thing.
Quite a different matter. A pattern that they represent, the conflict between brothers, the rivalry between brothers. This is a fundamental pattern, which yes, it's something that's there. But I care about facts. I mean, did they exist or did they not exist?
Why? Why does it matter if they existed or did not exist? I don't care about symbols. Well, we know, but you can't function in the world without them. So the fact that you don't care about them, symbols don't care about your facts, bro. Where are we going with this? Is ridiculous. This is a ridiculous way to talk. It's a ridiculous way to talk. You care about facts. Why? Why do you care about facts? What difference does it make if they lived or not? If the point is to point out a perennial pattern or a pattern between brothers that has existed since there have been brothers, what difference could the fact and what set of facts could make a difference? And how would you establish those facts? Oh, in order to do all of what I just said, you need symbols. Oops, because you need that vertical ordering connected to something else. Facts aren't floating around for you to grab as convenient when you feel like it. You can't derive them from your brain accurately and precisely. They're outside of you for sure. And therefore your access to them is limited. So people take the what is reality problem or does existence exist sort of nonsense, right out of philosophy. They just rip it right off without engaging with any of the work that's actually not terrible on it. And they say, well, but there are these facts. And it's like, but if they're outside of you, then they're part of what philosophers would call reality, guy. And if we have a limited access to reality, we have limited access to facts. If we have limited access to facts, we're right back in the same problem. You don't want to acknowledge that because you want to believe that there's an objective material reality. I'll link that video here. Why not? That we have access to, and therefore we can dispense with interpretation. We can dispense with variation. We can dispense with the idea that maybe there's things that I have access to that you don't, and vice versa. We can dispense with all of that in objective material reality because of science. But we can't. That's why we need symbols.
Well, I can imagine a situation where when the story was originated, that it referred to two actual brothers. But as the stories propagate across time, as they mutate, as they adapt, let's say, to the structure of human memory, they deepen and they become broader. And so then they become emblematic not only of the pattern of conflict that might characterize the original two brothers that the story was about, but about the conflict between brothers as such, and then the more fundamental levels of conflict that exist within human beings, which is what you see in more sophisticated literature. It's like the Bible.
Okay, I gotta stop. I'm never getting through this video. It's gonna be like 17 parts. I want to point out the first part of what Peterson said is an exact description of memes. The difference is that they coalesce over time. And other things too, right? Like, oh, the representative patterns of the world or of reality might be another way to say that. Notice how I'm just adding things like reality, right? And implementation and interpretation. And suddenly all of this stuff can be made sense of with fewer words in less time. You can argue, Mark, you've talked more than 14 minutes or whatever we've actually done on the clock. Sure, but I'm trying to explain what they're talking about in a way that can be made sense of, because what they're talking about doesn't make any sense. Sorry. Even Peterson is really not making good sense here, because he's not adding in these other concepts like time and perennial patterns and the ordering of hierarchy versus the idea of hierarchy as ordered, right? You still have to have a top and a bottom, bro. Otherwise, this hierarchy thing can't be made sense of. And when we think about these concepts, one way to split this up is to say memes spread out and archetypes unify. There you go. I answered the initial question, solved it for you. How's that? Pretty easy, huh? It's not that hard. Oh, why do memes spread out? Because they fall down. And why do archetypes unify? Because they're above us. Look at that. Wasn't that easy? It seemed really easy to me. I don't know why they're struggling with this.
Biblical accounts speak of fact in a factual manner upon occasion, but the biblical accounts also speak poetically and metaphorically and allegorically, and people who are sophisticated in biblical analysis have known this for centuries. The biblical literalists generally suffer from the problem that they don't even know what it means to be literalist. There's lots of unsophisticated ways of approaching a text.
Okay, let's see what Professor Dawkins thinks about that.
Well, I suppose I'm a literalist. I mean, and you give the game away when you say Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in a natural way.
Well, I'm speaking allegorically there within the confines of the text. I mean, what I meant by that was that the way the story lays itself out is that Adam and Eve are created by God. And so they're not emblematic of the pattern of human beings that exist in fallen history within the confines of the text.
Oh my goodness. So being a literalist and being a fundamentalist are the same thing, just to let you know. Literalist is just secular speak for fundamentalist. Right? We're just not talking about a quote religion that we're, say, aware of. I don't know what Dawkins' religion actually is. I look how he acts in the world and I get questions. He's definitely acting out, we'll say, archetypal religious patterns or something, or maybe perennial patterns. See my patterns of religion video. So the fundamental difference here that Peterson's missing so far, I don't think he's going to get to it, is Adam and Eve do not have parents in the way that you and I have parents, because the parents of Adam and Eve, such as they may have parents, are not like them in that they are human manifestations upon the creation, or within the creation. Upon the creation, my bad. Within the creation. Solved. Fixed.
First two people who are genuine, who aren't creations of the divine, are Cain and Abel. And so for me, they're emblematic of the patterns of conflict that rip people apart in the world of history, in the world of normal history.
So another way to say that is that they are more like us. We can relate to them because they have parents like us. We don't get to talk about their parents much from what I recall of the story, which might not be much, because the parents aren't part of the story, which is why Peterson's making that distinction. He's saying, no, they were born, so they're like us. They didn't get created by the creator like Adam and Eve, which is a difference, and it's an important difference. And there's a reason why it's an important difference, and the reason why is because we'll call it the pure creation is not fallen, right? It falls. At least in the story, the way Peterson's parsing it. We could have arguments of whether or not that's actually how the story is laid out or something. Or you could go to Alex O'Connor. Well, sin must have existed in them, and therefore they weren't pure because they did the thing that caused the fallen thing. But that's self-referential gobbledygook, as I pointed out in my commentary on the Peugeot and O'Connor video. So without going down that road, you can just say, yeah, there's a fundamental difference here, and it makes the characters of the story more relatable. In other words, we can more easily relate to and understand the allegory. Symbols are all about relationship and the qualities of those relationships. In other words, intimacy.
Professor Dawkins, I know you take particular umbrage with that statement that Cain and Abel were the first normally born human beings, but I think if I understand Dr. Peterson correctly, there are things that can be sort of true within a story. It's true that Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street, and as far as I understand, that's maybe what you mean by the truth in the matter of Cain and Abel being the first naturally born humans. It's internal to the story.
Well, in the context of this story, they're the first two spirits or patterns you could think of, patterns of perception and action.
Yes.
That characterize human existence in the fallen world, right? So they're emblematic of what happens in history outside of the whatever is meant by the pre-existent paradise.
But at the same time, you must know, I know this comes up all of the time when somebody says, but did Cain and Abel really exist? And I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question. I think it's like asking whether Raskolnikov existed in Crime and Punishment. Like it's not a trivial question, because you can answer yes and you can answer no. You can say, well, there was no such specific person as Raskolnikov, but it's not a helpful question, because the reason that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a masterpiece is because Raskolnikov was everywhere in Russia when Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment. And so Raskolnikov is hyper-real, not real.
But to be clear.
Okay, I want to point something out here, which I hadn't really noticed before, at least in a way I could articulate. So O'Connor actually splits the definition of truth. Because it can be true within the story. Wait a minute. Dawkins' whole thesis is that stories aren't true. And my thesis would be some stories are true and some stories are not. So what does it mean to be true within the story? Well, if it's a, quote, false story or an untrue story, what would it mean to be true within the, right? So what we've done is we've compressed the frame, right? We've taken the frame from, we'll call it capital T truth, because this is the way these people talk for some stupid reason. And we'll say, okay, well, there's capital T truth, but there's a lowercase t truth within the story. And it's like, but then the frame of truth is now the story. And if the story is a bunch of lies and contains no truth, there's still a truth within the story. And that would be bad, because now you can't differentiate truth anymore. Right, because truth relies on framing. This is a postmodern move, and the reason why postmodernism eats itself is because it's fundamentally parasitic. You're using the concept of capital T truth, you're trying to replicate it at a smaller frame, right, without accounting for, is that a valid frame, right? People do this all the time with everything. They go, little kids, right? Well, not me took the cookie. What do you mean, not me took the cookie? Well, in the context of the story the boy is telling, that's true because he believes it. Because if he doesn't believe it, he's going to get punished. This is a problem. But O'Connor can't counter that, right? Because he has to peel outside the story to a capital T truth or a capital R reality. They do the same thing to reality. They'll split reality all the time too, though. Small r reality and large r reality, or they'll say meta reality and reality, or whatever. They either go up one step or down one step. The small r, big R, small r, or meta and the thing, whatever. It's the same move in a different direction, and they're both invalid moves, by the way, just completely invalid. Don't let people do that. They're gobbledygooking, right? And so this isn't helpful, right? Because the fact that something true when you're in the frame doesn't tell you anything at all. At all. It's garbage in, garbage out information. It's total trash. Who cares? I think a better way to talk about Raskolnikov is Raskolnikov is archetypal in that you will see elements of his pattern all over Russia at the time. See, this is why my video on story, narrative, and archetype is important, like really important, right? Because now we are not dealing with the order of hierarchy at all, because it's not an order of hierarchy issue. It's 3 layers of analysis, story being the lowest, the implementation, right? Or the instance, the specific instance, narrative being the thing that we'll say that we have fewer of, that stories, so in other words, you need multiple stories to have narrative. You can't link a narrative to a story. That's not possible, right? So multivariate, right? Lots of connections, symbolic, right? Where are the symbols? The symbols are in the narrative, right? And then multiple elements or aspects or narratives point upwards to the archetypes. And that's how they're illuminated, because they're 2 layers above us. Archetypes are 2 layers above us, at least. So when you can think about it that way, you can realize, oh, there's an archetypal cultural set of cultural behaviors that is Raskolnikov, or that is symbolized within Raskolnikov. And you will see elements, 1 or more, maybe all, but at least 1 or more, everywhere you look in Russia at the time. Abso-freaking-lutely. I think that's a better way to say what Peterson's trying to say. I think poorly, by the way. If you intuited his meaning, great, that's awesome, fantastic. The danger is that when you're not clear enough, people can intuit a different meaning. So maybe you got it right, and you understood it, and hopefully what I said helped, so that now you can articulate it, right? Maybe, I don't know, and maybe not. That's fine too. Don't necessarily have to, right? But other people will intuit it differently. And that's actually what you're seeing, is Dawkins intuiting what Peterson's saying differently. That's what you're seeing. So it's important to know that, like IQ and education and all these other factors that people suddenly think are important that were never important before, don't help with this problem. They don't resolve the interpretation and understanding and can I grasp a concept problem. And do I have the concept? Like, has that concept been, have I been exposed to that concept? It doesn't solve any of those issues. But those are the issues we're actually grappling with in this conversation and in you watching conversations. Because, again, you got to know what people are talking about. See my, Peterson Vervaeke thing. You can, I go over it better there.
Is that how you feel about Cain and Abel? That is to say, an identifiable
hyper real
Homo sapiens called Cain.
It's irrelevant.
Who murders his brother.
In a sense, it's irrelevant to me, because even if they were real, like, we don't know anything about them as historical figures.
Of course, even if they weren't real, of course they weren't real.
Well, like I said, it could have been the case that...
Of course they weren't real? Okay. Kicked out of science forever. You can't make a scientific claim like that, ever. You can't say, of course they weren't real. You don't have access to evidence that would say one way or another. You don't have any access to any type of evidence that would say one way or another. So when you say that, you're being an arrogant prick, and you're not doing anything else, by the way. You do not have the ability to make that statement authoritatively, because you don't have the ability to have access to whether or not they were real. And you haven't defined reality. So really, you're playing very fast and loose with the language, very unscientific. And you're just making a claim because you want to make that axiomatic claim. And there's no way to make that axiomatic claim. And it's an irrelevant claim. This is a diversion. Peterson started very wisely from it doesn't matter if they're real. That is correct. It doesn't matter at all. So why are you bringing it up if it doesn't matter to his point? Can we stick to the point, or are you going to be a jerk about this issue? This isn't that hard. He said it doesn't matter. Maybe don't bring it up. That's how this works. In a proper debate, that would have been flagged, and that behavior would have been pointed out immediately. I'm here to point it out because apparently no one else can do this very simple job of pointing out a transgression like that. Dawkins does not have the authority or ability to make that statement and have it hold any water. Because how the hell does he know? Was he there? Of course not. Well, then why is he making the statement? Is the statement relevant? No. Peterson already invalidated the question of reality by saying it doesn't matter if they're real. Why are you bringing it up? What is going on? Why not get along and come with the conversation and stick to the topic at hand? Oh, I know, because you're wrong about everything, and Peterson's actually not. That's why. That's why.
When the story originated, way back when it originated, that the first people that were described by the first person who generated the seeds of the Cain and Abel story were referring to actual people. But it doesn't matter because the text is being compressed and modified over a vast span of time. And it's accreted all sorts of meanings that certainly weren't part and parcel of whatever the original story was.
Take the point Alex was making. Within the confines of the story, Dostoevsky was a great writer. What makes you think the writers of Genesis were a great writer? I mean, who were they? We know nothing about them.
Well, I think that,
This is a trick. And this is a really stupid trick, by the way, because I'm going to expose it right here. How do you know someone's a great writer? Who's doing that judging? And what are they judging it on the basis of? Oh, you're reading the works to determine that, aren't you? Okay, so we have the same amount of information to determine great writer as with Dostoevsky as we have with whoever unknown wrote Genesis. We have access to the same level of information that is required to determine good writing. The same. See the trick he did? Right. And no one else did either, I'm sure, or very few people. And it's little things like this that aren't little at all that slide right past people. And most of them don't slide past me. And this is why I get very upset with these people. I despise people like that. I despise them. I used to hang around Harvard Square and just seething every time I bumped into these people because they're all the same and they're all like this. And there are some exceptions, sure, because, universals, right? Very hard to find. But boy, Harvard just cranks out people like this. Just cranks them out. It's like they mold them that way, right from the word go. Don't believe me? Watch the movie Good Will Hunting. Why is it such a good movie? It's a better movie for me than most because, boy, I knew those Harvard people that are in that movie. I knew them well. And boy, is that bang on. Couldn't be more accurate a movie if it tried. Did those events happen? Some of them did. Maybe not to the same people or with the same groups. Some of them did. Did anyone ever do a comeuppance and tell the Harvard student what he was going to study next? Did that never happen? Oh, no, it happened. You know how I know? I've done it to them. That's how I know it happened. What utility is this factual it happened? Just tell me that. Just, where is it? And this is why I don't like those people. I don't like a trick like that. Like, what are you going to do? Have the FBI run a background check on the author? I don't, what? And that'll determine if he's a good author? That won't tell you anything about, what? It's so disingenuous. Look, I'm sure he doesn't mean it because I don't think he's smart enough to, but also not smart enough to.
I think they were great writers because I think I understand the patterning of the stories and what it points to. I think the idea, for example, that Cain and Abel are emblematic of two opposed patterns of adaptation to the world is brilliant. It's almost brilliant beyond imagining, especially because the story is so insanely compressed. And it's certainly evident to me as a clinician that the patterns that are portrayed in the story of Cain and Abel play themselves out in the real world continually and terribly, terribly.
You think that
Brilliant answer by Peterson. Yes, 100%. That was the correct answer. Although, again, and this is where we fail in society in general, he did not counter with, what were your criteria? Here's my criteria. What are yours? What information could you hope to glean by knowing who the author was? Like, what would change if you knew who the author was? And what would you do to determine what you stated? And the reason why that's important is because these people just shift. You give them an answer, you totally destroy their point, and they just shift to the next point. And so you're not exposing them as the frauds that they are. That is a fraudulent question. It is designed as a fraudulent question. Whether it was designed by his conscious mind or his unconscious mind, I know not, nor do I particularly care. Or perhaps it was designed by a demon that possessed his soul. I have no idea. I really don't care, but it was a carefully designed statement to, make an invalid point in an argument that he is losing badly. So good on Peterson, but also you have to push back on this. We have to expose this kind of behavior for what it is. Otherwise, people are never going to be able to determine who's a good person, who's capable of engaging in these deep conversations, and who isn't. Because we have a big problem with that now. Huge problem with that now. And we're never going to know if we don't counteract it by asking them, what difference does your statement make? How does that change the game? Because in this case, it definitely wouldn't have.
the author of that story in Genesis was a literary genius?
I think that there's a spirit of literary genius at work across millennia, crafting that story so that it has almost an infinite depth. How that relates to the original author or sequential authors, I don't know, because it's lost in the seeds of time. It's lost in history.
So this
Okay, I do want to point out something here. I actually don't like that answer one little bit. Okay, what Peterson did here, and I'm not going to criticize him for the move. I'm going to say I don't like the answer. But what Peterson did with the move was he said, I'm going to anticipate objections, and I'm going to front run all those objections by acknowledging there are multiple authors, and I'm going to appeal to the spirit. Instead, I would have said, yes, I think it's a genius story, and let Dawkins deal with the fallout from your stance. And I think when people will intuit a sense that he didn't just directly answer the question that Dawkins asked, which is an easy question in my mind. Like, yeah, I think it's a genius story. Right? And let Dawkins make the next move. That's what I would have done. Hopefully, what I think I would have done. Hopefully, had I been in that situation. I've done it before. I just said, yeah, and now what? Can we move on? Right? Oops. Right. But he's anticipating a trap. And I'm like, well, maybe you're anticipating a trap, but if you're on the side of truth, traps won't work anyway. So who cares if it's a trap? I don't know. So that may be why people are uneasy with the answer, because we'll say an Anglo-Catholic person would just say, yes, of course, and move on and let Dawkins try to do something with that, which he can't. Like, what? Are you denying my personal truth, dude? I've done this before. I've gone there before. Right? And then they get frustrated and they throw up their hands because you've destroyed their whole scientific system. I won't play objective material reality with you, and therefore you lose every time. Because objective material reality isn't real, you have no power at all of any kind. Right. Oops. So I got no problem with that move. I think it's a great move. Just frighten them into realizing that their little system is unimportant and won't change the world. Oops. Because that's really what's going on. Right? This, much vaunted battle between science and religion, which doesn't exist except in the mind of sciences or the scientisty people or whatever. Who cares? Like, it's just a battle for the same thing, right? When you say religion is attacking us and we need to defend ourselves, when that's not happening, or you'd be dead because the religious people would take you out, which is what they've always done, by the way, which is the thing you complain about constantly, by the way. It's a little weird that you'd take the chance. So that didn't happen. That's good to know. What are you fighting for? Oh, you want to be the new religion. You want to be the new determiners of what's correct and what's not, and not this book that you don't like. Fair. Also, too.
Story evolved. You're saying it's the story
Like a meme. Yes, it
well,
evolved.
that's interesting.
It evolved to match the contours of the human memory. That's exactly it, is that these stories, that's part of their archetypal nature. Like, so they have a emotional and motivational expression, but as they propagate across time, they also evolve, so they're maximally memorable. And they're maximally memorable for a biological reason.
Well, that's very interesting. If they really did evolve over time, if you could actually trace successive manuscripts, you can't do that. I mean, there's presumably a couple of Hebrew manuscripts and a Greek one. And I mean, what do you mean when you say it evolved?
Well,
Okay, let me just point out a bunch of other tricks here. So memes are already viri. Viri already evolve. The evolve thing was already implied. Fair if you didn't catch it. Like, I get it. I don't think Dawkins caught the fact that he's already stuck himself in the evolutionary framework, which, again, I disagree with using, especially in this context, because it just doesn't have the tools to talk about these things at all. Right? It's the origin of species, not the origins of existence. If you start to understand the atheist position as mistaking Darwin's great work as being the origin of creation or the origin of existence or something, or the origin of reality, instead of the origin of species, and then understand what species are, right? We're talking about a very specific set of ontologies within biology. Oh, within specific set. Right. But they always make this mistake. They think evolution explains everything, and it doesn't explain much, actually, and it wasn't supposed to. I think they need to reread Darwin. Now, I haven't read the entire book, but like the God guys in there all over the place. So I don't know. Same with Plato. Mysterious. These God things keep cropping up as justifications in these so-called scientific texts, as though Immanuel Kant is just an idiot, and of course philosophy is the handmaiden of religion, or something. But this trick, right, and actually what Peterson outlined is, well, a meme that evolves and is maximally rememberable cross-culturally, and with even just within a culture, is an archetype. That kind of works. I think I made that point earlier, actually, in the video, although it's hard to remember now. This is getting long, right? I don't understand. Like, sure, absolutely. I 1,000,000,000% agree. Now what? What are we talking about here? Because that's like, what are we talking about? Sure. And then Dawkins does another trick and goes back to the text. Well, we don't have successive texts. We do, so that's a lie. It's wrong. It's factually inaccurate. Just incorrect, fundamentally. We do. We do have those texts. Sorry, bro. You just don't know enough about the subject you're talking about, and now you're making a fool of yourself. But why does that matter? Peterson's point was about the evolution of the idea, not the evolution of the implementation or manifestation of the idea, right? So there's different ways you can manifest it. I feel like I went over this earlier. Forgive me, I need to go over it again. An idea can be written, or it can be spoken, or it can be drawn. Just to name three. There's many. Or it can be acted out. That's what a play is. Ballet, maybe. It can be sung. Right? There's a bunch of ways ideas can be transmitted. Or they can move. Oh. So what he's done in his little flat world is he said, oh, the idea doesn't evolve because I don't have consecutive texts to reference to follow that evolution. Well, A, you do. Maybe you don't have as many of them as you'd like, which is true of all of biology in relation to evolution, by the way, technically speaking, right? This is where you get that so-called bursty evolution stuff where animals just seem to change in a very short time frame for no apparent reason. Oh, we didn't bring that up. Weird that we left that out. Right? And some just speculate it's due to missing information because we don't have most of the information about evolution. Let me go over that again. We don't have most of the information about evolution. Insofar as you want to appeal to genetics, you can. You're still wrong, but whatever. I don't care. You're still wrong. And that's provable. And many people know this and have talked about it. Didn't come from my head. Like, it's all stuff I read about. Sorry. It's all stuff I've researched. Dawkins has not researched any of this stuff, but he did run a computer simulation if his first book, I think it's his first book, The Blind Watchmaker, is to be believed. So he should know this because, in fact, the story that he tells, at least in the first half of the book, I never finished it because barf, is that he forgot to write a way to save his software after he wrote it, his little evolutionary simulator. And then he lost all those things and never saw some of them again. Really? Could that happen in the real world too? Even though it happens in the smaller simulation? Weird. That would mean the world is a self-similar fractal, by the way. But anyway, I digress. You can see the trick here. He's moving from the concept of an idea changing over time or evolving to the manifestation of the idea in the book and in a specific book. Because I would argue that's a harder case to make. A lot of these patterns are repeated within the Bible. So what are we talking about? That's why people get uneasy feelings about this when they're, we'll say, a believer.
I would say you can see that in the compilation of the biblical texts, because one of the things that you see evolve, and you criticized the biblical text at one point. Correct me if I've got this wrong, because I don't want to get this wrong. You said that there isn't anything in the biblical text that constitutes, let's say, significant original discovery, which is something that you'd expect if it was of divine providence, let's say, divine provenance. And so, and I think, I was thinking about that objection, and I think that one of the discoveries that the text lays bare in an insanely brilliant manner is that the foundation of the community is sacrifice, that's an appropriate conceptualization. And you can see the concept of sacrifice evolve across the biblical texts as they're sequenced chronologically in the overall story that makes up the biblical text. The idea of sacrifice becomes more and more sophisticated. It's more and more elaborated. It's more and more specified. It's more and more embodied. There's an obvious progression in ideas.
Okay, I want to point out a bunch of things here. So, what Dawkins does with his critique, which wasn't actually stated here, we'll say, is just, again, axiomatically state nothing in the Bible is an original discovery. Now, if he hadn't flattened time down to zero, or the time when he was conscious, or I don't know where he's flattened it to, I can't really tell, to be honest. It doesn't really matter. He's definitely flattened it. How the hell would you know? Like, seriously, how would you know? Were you there 2,500 years ago or whatever when the first copy was written down, or I don't know, however old the Bible is? Well, if you weren't there, then you can't possibly ever, under any circumstances, know that that isn't original thought. That's actually not possible. Again, right? He's played this trick again. Axiomatic statement for which he cannot possibly ever have any evidence, and therefore it's unscientific. Now, if you want to make it as a statement of belief, you can. Now we're going to run into a different rabbit hole, right? What makes your beliefs better than my beliefs about whether or not the Bible is true and original thought? Right. Also, again, we're stuck in the implementation. I hate to break this to everybody who doesn't already know. We got the written word from talking first, and therefore there's an oral tradition that precedes all this. And so again, his dogged focus on the Bible and the authors is A, absurd, B, inappropriate, and C, completely invalid. I don't know what else to say about that. And you can see how they struggle with authors, and we'll say authors we have more information about because they're closer to us in time versus authors we have less information about because they're further back in time. I don't know why anybody would struggle with this, but this is where we're at for some odd reason. And it's an issue, right? It's an actual problem. And so we need to think more about these sorts of tricks that people are playing. Like, look, I don't think he's doing it maliciously. I think he's stupid. I read The Blind Watchmaker, half of it, and I was like, this guy's a little on the slow side, to be honest. Who writes a piece of software and doesn't put a save function in it? It's easy for me to say. I'm a software engineer. Of course you do. I've written evolutionary simulators a number of times. Of course you put a little save routine in there. Okay. You know, yeah, in some sense it's a weak critique. I get that. But also, like, look, the world is complex. And Dawkins has limitations like everybody else. And to me, this just shows his limitations of thought. He's not accounting for time. He doesn't understand implementation or manifestation versus, we'll say, process or principle. He doesn't understand order and sequence. He doesn't understand up and down. Neither does Peterson, by the way, I would argue, although I'd love to have that conversation with him someday. If you can hook me up, hook me up. So you just have to be aware that this is happening all the time with these conversations, with all of them. People have limitations, and you should be able to spot their limitations, because then you can get something useful out of their work. If you don't know where someone's wrong, throw out all their work just to be safe. This is why I won't read Carl Jung. I can't figure out where he went wrong. I know he went wrong. I just don't know where, and so I'm not touching his stuff. It's that simple. That he's not the only one I'm doing that with. It's just that there's an easy hit. I'm not reading any of his books. I'm scared to death of reading any of them because I don't know where he went off the rails. Clearly went off the rails. I just can't figure out where. So I'm not going to do it. Because I don't want to get infected with this sort of thing where you're doing this to people and having these conversations and inflicting it on thousands of people, maybe millions of people. I don't know how many people are going to watch this. This is terrible, terrible way to deal with these subjects. And, you know, I mean, Peterson's to blame somewhat, but Dawkins, big time. And you want to have a moderator that can follow some rules here. And he's not pointing out these problems. And a good moderator in a debate would point out these problems. He would say, what difference does it make if there are multiple authors? What if the ideas, insofar as they're mimetic, what difference does it make if they're written down or not even? Like, let's answer those questions first and then move on to those critiques. Let's set some groundwork here. Why does it matter who authored something? How do you determine a good author? Should that even be part of the discussion? You know, I mean, I'm happy to entertain these things because I know how to win these arguments every single time because there's a couple little tricks to this. you have to be super attentive. Not everybody can do it. Like, you have to really be on what people are saying. Be real careful, and be able to do things like this, which, you know, if you didn't see these things, and fair enough, I don't think most people will, maybe you can't do that the way I can. But I've had decades of practice with these types of people.
Progression, where do you see that progression? In successive manuscripts, or I don't...
It's in the successive stories as the text progresses, the way a novel progresses.
So something like
Like
sacrifice in the Old
Genesis,
Testament,
or...
sacrifice in the Old
No,
Testament.
through the entire
all the way
the
through to the New Testament.
Text is a sacrificial story as well. The Passion story is a story of sacrifice.
It is
and
indeed.
the sacrificial motif recurs continually through the biblical text, and it's elaborated constantly. And
Okay, so the criticism is the Bible as a text gives us nothing to indicate that it has divine origin. There's nothing that we can read in it where we think there's no way this idea could have evolved were it not divinely put into this text. That's a criticism that perhaps
Is that
Professor
what you
Dawkins
think?
made in the past.
well, I think it's reflective of some order that's so profound and implicit that there isn't a better way of describing it than divine. But I don't really care if we look at that from the bottom up, like as a biological phenomena, or as from the top down. I don't think it makes any difference.
It doesn't.
Aha! There it is. He gave away the whole game. This is what I'm saying. He's an emergence is good guy. Right? That's it. That's the emergence is good. I don't care if you talk about it bottom up or top down. Now, to be fair, to some extent, I agree. I can talk about it bottom up and shred your goofy arguments just as easily as, or actually maybe more easily than somebody who talks from the emanation point of view or the top-down point of view. Right? You have to be really good to do that. Christian apologists are just the worst at that whole thing because they have to rely on the top-down. They don't have a choice. But I don't have to rely on the top down to show them that your logic, reason, rationality is garbage and doesn't say what you think it says. It actually refutes your point every time, which is weird unless it's not a coincidence, just a reflection of reality. Now, this idea that the order emerges is very different from we're conforming to a pre-existing order. Pre-existing is the word that's missing here, right? Another way to talk about something that pre-existed you might be the word creation. Creation denial. There it is. Hopefully you're getting a sense for what I'm talking about when I say creation denial, right? It's right there. This is an excellent example. Oh, and I don't care about creation. I don't care about top-down order. I don't care about emanation, right? Emanation is top-down order. It's order from above, among other things, right? I don't care about those things. Okay. Fair in the context of arguing whether or not these ideas are good or bad. But, and like I said, I'm a fan, actually. But what you mean is there's something outside of us. So this is what I mean when I say middle out thinking, or part of what I mean, right? Or this from the individual out. There's no such thing as an individual. Never has been, never will be. But this is why he doesn't care if it's top down or bottom up. But the thing is, if there's something below you, that actually changes everything. And if there's something above you, that changes everything differently. Right, because scale matters, and maybe there's lots of things below you, and there's only a few things above you that will, say, persist over time or something. That would make a big difference to how you think about the world. Now, you have to think about the world. Well, how you think about the world is not, quote, your world view necessarily. It's your religion. Right? And the way you know how you think about the world is not through your speech. It's through your action. See how I've just reframed a bunch of Peterson's work? Right. So there's a participatory engagement with the world reflects your participatory knowing of the world, if you want to put it in Vervaeke, fancy Vervaeke language, and that changes everything. Because now you can, to some limited extent, and it is limited, derive a person's beliefs, also constitutive of their religion, right, from their action in the world, irrespective of their words. Ah, this is so handy. Like, knowing what I just outlined is super handy. It's how I do everything. And it's not that I don't listen to their words, although sometimes I ignore their words because they're in contradiction. Performative contradiction is what I would claim it's supposed to be, with what they're saying. Right? If you say, I don't beat animals while you're beating an animal, we got a problem. Right? I'm not going to believe the other things you say either, or at least I'll believe them selectively, because your words don't match your actions. And words aren't supposed to match actions, by the way. Right? You can state your intent. Well, what the hell is that? You haven't done it yet. How can your words match your actions? Right. Oh, Mark, they're going to match your future actions. Are they? Is that reliable? I don't know. The future's kind of weird, man. Doesn't work out the way I want. Doesn't work out the way I expect most of the time. In some limited, very limited framed circumstances. Collapse the frame, flatten the world, increase the prediction. Yes. It's a trade-off. Think about more of the world, decrease the prediction. Right. Oh. So look, this is great. I get to outline all of this. This is wonderful. I am thoroughly enjoying this, but I'm also thoroughly tired and still recovering from this nasty cold. One of the third worst colds I've ever had. I just have not been getting work done. So I apologize for how long this has taken, and I've failed to release a bunch of videos that I have ready for some reason. Cold or miserable. I'm gonna end it here. We're gonna pick it up later and see how far we can go. Look, I hope this was helpful. Let me know in the comments. I like hearing, feedback, even if it's negative. That's fine too, right? I learn from the negative stuff. I don't really learn anything from the positive stuff, but it does make me feel better. And I have a cold. I need to feel better. But let me know how this is going for you, and if it's been helpful. And hopefully, it's actually looking like this is going to be a nice springboard conversation for me to outline a bunch of stuff that I can't outline any other way, or haven't been able to thus far. So let me know what you think. And look, I'll see you next time. Thank you for your time and attention.
It doesn't make a difference whether it was divinely inspired or whether it evolved within human